Long before Eve ever stepped into the garden, another woman stood beside Adam. Her name, though whispered only in apocryphal echoes, was Lilith. A name that lingers like a shadow on the edges of sacred tradition, barely mentioned, frequently misunderstood and often erased. Her story has been silenced for centuries, but now it demands to be heard. Who was Lilith? Was she truly the mother of demons, the bringer of chaos, the seductress haunting the night? Or was she something far more complex, a powerful woman, vilified by fear and forgotten by design? These are not idle questions of myth and mystery. They speak to something deep within the collective memory of humanity, something buried beneath layers of doctrine, custom, and interpretation. When most people hear the name Lilith, they imagine a creature of darkness, a symbol of rebellion wrapped in taboo. Yet, in older writings and forbidden scrolls, a different picture begins to emerge, one that refuses to be easily dismissed. Her tale is not one of evil, but of exile, not of wickedness, but of will. And in that exile, we find the first ripple in the fabric of spiritual authority, the first challenge to a structure that would soon come to dominate the world. Why was her story pushed to the margins? Why do major religious texts remain silent where her name should have echoed? Could it be that her presence was too inconvenient, too disruptive, too free? The tale of Lilith is not just a forgotten footnote in theological history. It is a mirror held up to the soul of a civilization that has long struggled with questions of equality, power, and the divine image. This journey is not one of idle speculation. It is a search through time-worn pages, cryptic scriptures, and the shifting tides of interpretation. It begins in silence, in the absence of her name from the book of Genesis, and yet that silence speaks louder than words. For behind it lies a storm of cultural anxiety, fear of the independent woman, and a need to preserve an order that demanded obedience. Lilith's presence, whether factual or mythical, forces us to ask, what are we willing to forget to preserve comfort? What truths have been buried because they were too wild, too unyielding, too free to control? To uncover Lilith's truth is to walk a delicate path, one where ancient languages whisper through fragments of parchment, and where stories lost to time resurface with startling clarity. Her legacy cannot be contained within neat labels. She refuses definition. She exists at the edges of belief, between the sacred and the profane, between humanity and divinity. As we begin this exploration, let us not turn away from the uncomfortable. Let us not dismiss what tradition would rather forget. Let us instead lean into the silence and ask why it exists. What if the demon we were taught to fear was never a demon at all? Lilith's story, obscured by centuries of religious silence, begins not in rebellion, but in creation, at the very foundation of humanity. While the Genesis account most are familiar with describes Eve as emerging from Adam's rib, a secondary creation crafted for companionship and support, another version exists, one older and more radical in its implications. This alternative account is found not in the canonized texts of the Hebrew Bible, but in the margins in writings like the Alphabet of Ben Sira, an ancient and controversial Jewish text dating back to the medieval period, which boldly introduces a different beginning. According to this text, Lilith was not formed after Adam, nor was she made from any part of his body. She came into being at the same moment, from the same soil, fashioned by the same divine hands. Earth was their shared origin. This detail, while seemingly minor, challenges the very structure of hierarchy. It strips away the layered assumptions of superiority and submission that have long colored theological teachings. If Adam and Lilith were made as equals, born of the same substance, breathing the same breath, then neither had claimed to rule over the other. Their relationship was not one of dominance and deference, but of parity, a balance that would later prove unsustainable within the patriarchal structures that began to define early religious thought. This shared origin also hints at a forgotten theological vision, one where divine intention did not begin with male leadership and female obedience, but with mutuality. To accept Lilith's equal creation is to entertain the possibility that the initial divine design included balance between the sexes, a harmony not rooted in hierarchy, but in unity. It presents a radical image of gender and spiritual value, one that directly challenges the foundations of many later religious doctrines. This is perhaps why Lilith's story was not merely ignored, but actively suppressed. Her equality was dangerous, not because it introduced evil, but because it disrupted control. The implications of being made from dust, identical in form and substance, go beyond biology. In many ancient cultures, the matter from which one is formed holds symbolic power. To be shaped from the same earth means to share status, dignity, and purpose. It means that neither was secondary, neither was lesser. This framing casts a long shadow over the traditional reading of Genesis, where Eve's creation from Adam's side has often been interpreted as signifying dependence or subordination. Lilith's origin, by contrast, suggests autonomy from the very beginning. And yet, this version did not take root in the dominant tradition. It lingered on the fringes, circulating in mystical writings, whispered in esoteric circles, and feared for its implications. The mere existence of a woman who could stand beside Adam, not beneath him, sparked unease in societies structured around male authority. Her equality was not celebrated, it was buried. Even within the Alphabet of Ben Sira, the account is delivered with tension, portraying Lilith not only as Adam's equal, but also as unwilling to accept any role that suggested otherwise. That, however, belongs to another part of her story. What matters in this chapter is the theological weight of her creation, that from the first breath, Lilith was not born to serve, but to stand. This version of creation forces a re-evaluation of spiritual anthropology, what it means to be human in the image of the divine. If both were made from the same matter, then both reflect divine essence. And if both reflect divinity equally, then power and authority cannot be justified through origin. The story of Lilith in this light becomes not a tale of rebellion, but of original justice, a justice that would soon be tested and rejected. Lilith's departure from Eden stands as one of the most profound acts of spiritual defiance recorded in ancient lore. It was not a rebellion rooted in wickedness or chaos, but in conviction, a deliberate protest against a role she never agreed to play. After being formed from the same earth as Adam, Lilith expected a union grounded in mutual respect and equality. Yet the harmony envisioned in their shared creation soon fractured under the weight of unspoken expectations. As Adam began to assert authority over her, presuming a structure of dominance, Lilith refused to comply. Her resistance was not an act of pride, but one of principle. The conflict that arose between them was not simply personal, it reflected deeper spiritual tensions. In the account from the Alphabet of Ben Sira, the disagreement reached its height when Adam insisted on taking the superior position in their union, assuming privilege in both relationship and intimacy. Lilith objected, asserting that since they were created equally, there was no justification for one to dominate the other. Her words were not merely those of a spouse arguing a role, but of a soul defending its inherent dignity. The text presents her as invoking the name of the Most High, not to curse, but to claim a truth she believed had been divinely granted, her right to equality. This moment, where Lilith utters the ineffable name of God and takes flight from Eden, marks a turning point not only in her story, but in the larger narrative of spiritual autonomy. To speak the divine name was no small act. It signified a deep, personal connection to the divine, a relationship not mediated through any other being. In doing so, Lilith did not abandon God. She abandoned a structure she saw as unjust. Her departure was not from divinity, but from a human arrangement that sought to confine her. In the aftermath of her flight, 3 angels were sent to retrieve her, tasked with urging her return and threatening consequences should she refuse. Yet Lilith did not yield. Her response to their pleas reveals the depth of her resolve. She chose exile over submission, spiritual isolation over compliance. It was a costly decision. According to tradition, the punishment for her refusal was severe. She would be associated with infant mortality, cast as a night demon, blamed for tragedies that befell the innocent. But even in the face of this fearsome destiny, she did not relent. Her decision can be seen as a form of martyrdom, a sacrifice of paradise for the sake of principle. Unlike Eve, whose creation followed the fall, Lilith's story is shaped entirely by the act of walking away. Her legacy was born not from sin, but from refusal. She challenged a world that offered her no place unless she bowed her head, and in doing so, she carved out an identity that was both feared and revered. The refusal to submit redefined what it meant to stand before the divine, not as a servant, but as an equal. In this act, Lilith became a symbol of spiritual integrity, one whose choices would echo through generations of mystical thought. She refused to accept a definition of womanhood that denied her voice, and in doing so, she paid the price of erasure. Her story became a whisper, then a warning, and eventually a myth. But beneath it all remained a powerful truth, that the first to leave Eden did so not in disgrace but in protest. The transformation of Lilith from a woman of principle into a feared demon did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, shaped by centuries of theological discomfort and cultural unease. Her departure from Eden, a moment of defiance rooted in conviction, became the foundation for a myth that spiraled into darkness. As her story drifted from sacred texts into folklore and mystical writings, it was reshaped not to reflect her autonomy, but to punish it. What had once been an assertion of equality was reinterpreted as an act of rebellion, and from rebellion, it was only a small step in the eyes of the fearful to infer wickedness. In early rabbinic literature, Lilith begins to appear not as Adam's equal, or even as a former inhabitant of Eden, but as a creature of the night, one whose presence brought harm. The Babylonian Talmud references her as a winged being, dangerous and seductive, a threat to men and children alike. These depictions do not recount her creation or her decision to leave the garden. Instead, they focus on the consequences of her alleged vengeance. She is accused of seducing men in their dreams, of bearing demonic offspring, of stealing the breath of sleeping infants. These fears, cloaked in religious language, reflect not divine revelation, but human anxiety. By the medieval period, these fears had crystallized into doctrine and folklore. Amulets were crafted to ward her off, inscribed with the names of the angels who once pursued her. Mothers hung charms above cradles to protect their children from her grasp. Her name, once erased, now returned, though not as a partner to Adam, but as a nightmare lurking in the shadows. What she had refused to become in Eden, a submissive companion, had been replaced by what society feared most, a woman uncontrolled, untamed, and unrepentant. This demonization served a deeper function than mere storytelling. It acted as a warning, a cautionary tale wrapped in religious authority. To question male dominance, to reject prescribed roles, to walk away from unjust expectations, these acts were not just discouraged, they were vilified. And Lilith, with her ancient defiance, became the perfect symbol for that vilification. Her transformation into a monster allowed patriarchal systems to reinforce obedience through fear. If the price of independence was to be cast as demonic, then submission appeared safer, holier, more acceptable. Yet beneath this fearful mask, the outlines of her original story remain visible. The attributes later assigned to her, sexual autonomy, refusal to obey, spiritual self-determination, are not signs of evil, but of resistance. The exaggerated fears projected onto her reflect more about the society that imagined them than the woman herself. These were not the traits of a demon, but of a person who could not be controlled. Her image as a destroyer of children, seducer of men, and enemy of domestic order can be read not as literal truth, but as symbolic punishment. In demonizing Lilith, religious thought sought to contain the danger she represented, the danger of a woman who would not submit. The question must then be asked, was this transformation truly about her nature, or about silencing what she stood for? If Lilith had been remembered not as a demon, but as a figure of moral conviction and spiritual courage, what impact might that have had on the understanding of womanhood, of divinity, of authority? Instead, her story was buried under layers of fear, altered to fit a world uncomfortable with her presence. And yet, the fact that her story survived at all, despite being exiled from scripture, condemned in legend and feared in superstition, speaks to its enduring power. It whispers of a truth too resilient to be extinguished. It hints that behind the mask of the demon was always the memory of a woman who dared to say no. When comparing Eve and Lilith, one does not merely examine two women of ancient tradition. Instead, one encounters two spiritual archetypes, two reflections of womanhood that stand on opposite ends of a divine spectrum. Their stories, taken together, do not just reveal how religious history has shaped perceptions of femininity, but how humanity has interpreted obedience, freedom, and the will of the divine itself. While Eve is often remembered as the obedient wife, fashioned for companionship and molded from Adam's own body, Lilith lingers in obscurity as the one who would not bend, who walked away when obedience was demanded and equality denied. Eve's creation is marked by a sense of dependency. Taken from Adam's rib, her very formation is tied to his. She is introduced not as an equal counterpart, but as a remedy to his solitude, a helper suited to his needs. This narrative, deeply woven into the religious consciousness of many cultures, has long been used to define the ideal traits of womanhood: nurturing, yielding, supportive, and above all, compliant. Her role in the fall, eating the forbidden fruit and sharing it with Adam, ironically does not remove this perception of her as obedient in nature. Instead, it often reinforces her as susceptible, in need of guidance, in need of correction. Lilith, by contrast, begins not in submission but in symmetry. Her refusal to accept subordination is not presented as a transgression of divine law, but as a disagreement within human relationship. She does not fall from grace through deception or disobedience to God, but through her unwillingness to obey Adam. The tension between them is rooted not in sin, but in a claim to equality that Adam would not accept. In this contrast lies a fundamental divide. Eve obeys her creator by accepting her role, while Lilith obeys her conscience by rejecting a role that denied her dignity. These opposing paths present two interpretations of holiness. In one, sanctity is found in yielding, in trust, in the quiet acceptance of divine design as interpreted through structure and hierarchy. In the other, holiness arises from authenticity, from staying true to one's divine image, even when that path leads into exile. Eve is praised for staying, even after transgression. Lilith is condemned for leaving, even before any sin is attributed to her. This dichotomy has shaped religious teachings for centuries, subtly reinforcing that spiritual value is tethered to obedience, particularly for women. But these figures also ask deeper questions, ones that disturb the comfortable borders between good and evil, between faithful and rebellious. If Lilith's refusal to be subordinate is a sin, then what does that say about freedom within divine order? And if Eve's submission is the model of virtue, what does that imply about the divine image in those who question, challenge, and refuse to be molded by the expectations of others? In this way, Eve and Lilith represent more than just individuals. They become symbols of choices, of postures before the divine. Eve is the path of integration, of remaining within the boundaries set by others, even at great personal cost. Lilith is the path of departure, of walking away from those boundaries when they no longer reflect the truth of one's creation. Each woman carries a lesson, a warning, and an invitation, not to follow blindly, but to reflect deeply on what it means to be formed in the image of God. This duality also speaks to the divine-human relationship itself. Is God better reflected in the obedient heart or in the uncompromising soul, in the one who trusts structure or in the one who trusts the voice within? These are not questions with easy answers. They are questions that continue to echo through the corridors of theology, feminism, and personal faith. Eve and Lilith are not merely two sides of the same coin. They are two paths placed before the soul, each with its own challenges, risks, and revelations. The absence of Lilith from the canon of sacred scripture is a silence that speaks volumes. It is not the result of oversight, nor of lack of relevance. Rather, it is the product of intentional omission, a decision shaped by the religious, cultural, and political forces that governed which stories would be preserved as divine truth and which would be buried under the weight of institutional memory. Her story, rich with spiritual and moral complexity, posed a threat to the emerging structures of patriarchal theology, and so, rather than engage with that threat, those in power chose to exclude her entirely. The formation of the biblical canon was never a purely spiritual endeavor. It was shaped by councils, debates, translations, and editorial choices that stretched across centuries. As early religious communities sought to establish orthodoxy and unity, they made decisions not only about what was sacred, but about what was safe. Narratives that challenged prevailing social norms, especially those that centered female autonomy or subverted traditional hierarchies, were often sidelined or discarded. In this context, Lilith's story was far too dangerous to remain in view. Her refusal to submit, her insistence on equality, and her bold departure from Eden undermined the theological narrative that placed man at the center and woman in a supporting role. It is telling that texts such as the Alphabet of Ben Sira, which contains one of the most detailed accounts of Lilith, were never granted canonical status. They circulated in the shadows, read by mystics, scholars, and dissenters, but never fully embraced by the mainstream religious institutions that governed spiritual life. The marginalization of Lilith mirrors the marginalization of voices like hers throughout history, voices that questioned, resisted, or defied structures of control. Her exclusion also reveals the mechanisms by which religious tradition has been shaped. The sacred was not merely received, it was curated. It was not only inspired, but filtered through the needs and fears of those who wielded religious authority. And when a figure like Lilith posed a challenge to that authority, the easiest response was silence. By erasing her from the accepted texts, her story lost its legitimacy. Without scripture to anchor her tale, she became a figure of folklore, a myth, a warning, no longer a human soul formed by divine hands, but a shadow cast by fear. Yet even in her erasure, Lilith persisted. Her name survived in incantations, her image in mystical writings, her legacy in whispered traditions. The attempt to remove her from the sacred narrative did not succeed in eliminating her entirely. Instead, it gave rise to a more complex question. Who decides which stories are holy, and on what grounds? If divine revelation is filtered through human hands, then it becomes vulnerable to human bias. The canon, though revered, is not immune to omission, and every omission has a reason. Lilith's absence forces us to confront the cost of spiritual censorship. It challenges us to consider what other truths have been set aside, what other voices have been muted in the pursuit of theological purity or social control. It invites us to imagine a sacred story that makes space for complexity, for dissent, for the difficult truths that do not always fit neatly into doctrines and creeds. In the end, Lilith's erasure is not only about her. It is about the systems that decide who is remembered and who is forgotten. It is about the quiet power of narrative and the responsibility of those who shape it. And it is about the enduring presence of stories that refuse to die, even when every effort has been made to silence them. Though centuries have passed since her name was first spoken in fear or forgotten by decree, Lilith's legacy endures with startling relevance. She has moved beyond the boundaries of myth and religious obscurity and entered into the realm of living memory. No longer just a figure in ancient lore, she has become a symbol, a banner carried by those who seek dignity, autonomy, and a voice that cannot be silenced. Her story, once used as a cautionary tale against disobedience, has been reclaimed as a declaration of spiritual sovereignty. In modern times, Lilith represents far more than a rebellious figure from ancient texts. She stands for every person who has been pushed to the margins, for refusing to conform. She echoes in the lives of those who question unjust systems, who walk away from roles that confine their essence, who challenge the authority of traditions that do not serve justice or truth. Her name is spoken today not in hushed fear, but in proud recognition of the courage it takes to stand alone. Across literature, art, music, and spiritual discourse, Lilith has re-emerged as a voice for the voiceless. Mystics and scholars have revisited her tale to uncover hidden wisdom, seeing in her journey not evil but insight. In the spiritual wilderness where she once wandered, others now walk freely, guided by the light of her example. Her exile has become a place of gathering, a sanctuary for those who were told they did not belong. Her story invites us to reconsider the meaning of rebellion. It asks whether true faith demands submission or whether it sometimes calls for defiance in the face of injustice. It challenges the idea that holiness is passive, that righteousness is always quiet. In Lilith, we see a form of sanctity that does not yield, a soul that honors the divine image by refusing to let it be distorted by human hands. As we reflect on her journey, from the first woman created in equality, to the one who chose exile over oppression, to the figure demonized and erased, and now to the symbol revived, we must ask ourselves what stories we still suppress today. Who remains unheard in our sacred narratives, whose truth is still waiting in the shadows? Lilith's legacy compels us to listen, to those who do not fit within our expectations, to those whose truths have been buried, to those who, like her, would rather stand alone in the wilderness than bow in a paradise built on silence. Her tale is not just a recovery of one woman's name, but a reminder that no story, once told with honesty and courage, is ever truly lost. Thank you for joining us on this powerful exploration into the forbidden story of Lilith. If you found this video meaningful, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss another journey like this one. Like the video to show your support, share your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear what this story means to you. And most importantly, share this video with your friends and family. Let the voice of Lilith be heard by those who need it most.